Well, thank you very much, everyone. I love being greeted with applause in the morning. I wish my kids did that for me. So today, obviously, we're going to be talking about elder abuse. It's a problem that affects hundreds of thousands of Canadians, yet most healthcare providers and service providers don't find elder abuse on their radar. So it's a big problem, and I'm here to help hopefully change that fact. So elder abuse is often referred to as a hidden crime because it's seldom reported. In fact, only about 1 in 5 cases of abuse are reported to the proper authorities. I think that's staggering. I think people hesitate in reporting abuse for many different reasons, which is probably due to the shame that we associate with being abused. It could be pride, family honor, fear, family dynamics, and values that prevent us from stepping forward and reporting these kinds of issues that we have at home. It's very concerning, to say the least, which is why I really want to focus my efforts on educating you today and just raise awareness about the issue. I think it's important for you to incorporate that in your practice when you are with your patients or your clients. Now, just to get a good idea of what you perceive as being a problem with elder abuse, do any of you think that it's illegal, first of all? Yeah? A few hands? Well, you might be surprised to find out that it's not. Unfortunately, there's no legislation to protect seniors, vulnerable seniors, like there are for children or even pets for that matter. I think it's kind of shameful that, you know, to think that your pets are probably better protected than you will be when you reach your older age. There are, however, systems that are put in place to protect children and animals, such as the Children's Aid Society, Humane Society, but not for seniors. And I think that as we work through these problems of raising awareness and bringing it to more of a political level and bringing more attention to it and making people realize how important it is to start funneling funds into the development of services and changing legislation, I think it's going to remain a particularly prominent problem. There are, however, laws that protect seniors from abusive behaviors, mostly around assault, theft, criminal negligence, harassment, and intimidation. So I think it's important for you to be aware of what those, well, to get familiar essentially with the criminal code and know what laws protect seniors. There is also a reporting system for abuse that happens in institutional settings, and I think a lot of people are not aware of that. So whenever you do encounter abuse that happens in a long-term care facility, or if your patient is a resident in a retirement home, you are mandated by law to report this to the the Retirement Homes Regulatory Authority or the Long-Term Care Ministry. So let's delve into the topic a bit more, but let's start off by talking a bit about the organization that I work for. So I work for Elder Abuse Ontario, which is a not-for-profit that was established in 1990. It's funded by the Ministry of Seniors Affairs, which is previously known as the Ontario Seniors Secretariat. And our mission is to create an Ontario where all seniors are free from abuse. And we do this by raising awareness, by educating, training service providers, building capacity in the community, collaborating with other agencies and organizations that offer service to prevent or to intervene in cases of abuse, and just generally advocating on behalf of seniors' rights. So what we do implement is Ontario's strategy to combat elder abuse, which was developed in partnership with the Attorney General and Ontario Victim Services. So as I had mentioned, we try to coordinate services, we offer training, and we raise public awareness in general. So one of the examples of raising awareness is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which happens on June 15th, and to kind of kick things off, the day before, on June 14th, we're holding an event on Parliament Hill June is Seniors Month. I don't know if you're aware of this, and this year's theme is Living Your Best Life. So we've focused on incorporating healthy living, healthy aging, and so we've used a free yoga session that's offered on Wednesdays on Parliament Hill, Phi Yoga. And so we're going to be, raising awareness at this yoga session on the 14th. So if any of you are interested in joining us, that would be great. So here's what we're going to learn today. First of all, I think it's important for you to get a better idea of what elder abuse is. You need to understand the prevalence of elder abuse among older adults in Canada, to identify the risk factors and complexities of elder abuse. Learn to identify the forms, what are the signs and behaviors you should be looking out for in your patients and clients. The role and responsibility of reporting under Ontario's legislation, and knowing what resources are available to help you deal with cases of elder abuse. So, what is elder abuse? The World Health Organization defines elder abuse as a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there's an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. Unlike random acts of violence or exploitation, elder abuse usually consists of repetitive instances of misconduct. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, at home or an institutional setting, and most of the time it happens at the hand of people that we love and trust most. Unfortunately, most of the time it's our children or spouses, family and friends that are exhibiting the abusive and manipulating behavior. So it's called a hidden crime because it's very seldom reported. I mentioned this earlier. Victims are often too scared or too vulnerable to report it, which is why it's so important for this to be on your radar. Elder abuse has significant mental health and physical health repercussions. And their effects are not to be taken lightly. In fact, we know that it invokes extreme levels of stress, it isolates people, causes physical trauma, it affects your sense of self-worth and dignity, leads to mental health problems like depression, and can set off underlying cognitive issues prematurely as well. So I don't know if this is surprising to you, but it's also been proven that it carries with it a high mortality rate. So the World Health Organization recognizes that it's a global public health and human rights issue. It's in fact an outright violation of one of humanity's most fundamental rights, the right to be safe and free from violence and oppression. So let's take a look. I got a schematic here that basically shows what happens in abusive relationships. It's all about an imbalance in power and control. So it's always the result of an imbalance in a relationship. There's often a dependency on the abuser or on the senior, which happens to open the door for unfair treatment. It isolates the senior, makes them more dependent of their abuser, and it just creates a vicious cycle. So if we take a look on the right, we see the results of the abusive behavior. So by frightening, humiliating, intimidating the senior, the abuser is better able to manipulate them to doing whatever they want. For example, let's think about a child who wants to move in back home with mom because he wants to save money to buy a house. He already has a wife and he has 2 kids. Mom doesn't necessarily want the whole family to move back in with them, but there's a lot of pressure being put on her. He says, Mom, if you don't let me come back home, I won't be able to save money for a house. I'm gonna have to move out of town. You'll rarely see me because I have to move to find more affordable housing. My family is getting larger. I can't stay in an apartment anymore. So if you don't help me, there's going to be consequences. I'm gonna have to move away. So although the child might not see that what they're doing is manipulating the mom to do something that she doesn't want to do, there is that power there that he gains, and he's able to manipulate her to do things that are to his benefit. But this can cause distress on the mom. She doesn't necessarily want to. And so this affects her right. He's able to manipulate her in making decisions she doesn't want to do. So let's take a look at this other slide here, which kind of shows how the balance of power and control work in the abuser's favor. So power is essentially having the choice to do whatever you want to do, to be who you are. And when an individual acts a certain way and exhibits abusive, manipulative behavior, they're able to gain power over that other person. And when another person feels like they don't have a choice, they tend to fold, right? If the senior feels like their child might be threatening them or coercing them to do something they don't want to do, but the consequences are that their relationship will no longer exist, then obviously they're going to do whatever they can to try to keep that relationship together, because it is their relationship with their child. So eventually the abuser will learn to develop a certain pattern of tactics that they'll use, whether they're aware of it or not. They learn certain tricks to help manipulate the mother or the father to do things that will go his way. The older adult also learns to give in to the abuser from fear of the consequences that will ensue. So why are we concerned now at this moment in time? I think it's important to realize that, I'm sure you've heard of this, that demographics are changing. We live in an aging society, and we know for a fact that there are now more seniors than there are children under the age of 14. Well, we call it the gray tsunami that's about to hit. And so I think it's important to realize that the more cases of elder abuse we're going to see, the more services those seniors are going to be utilizing. There's probably going to be an increase in hospitalization, and seniors are going to be forced to make changes in where they live, some important decisions. More and more seniors are probably going to be moving in institutional settings, for example. But because of diversity, there might also be more seniors who are going to be living at home with their children and their family. And this can put a greater strain on frontline service providers in the community as well. So this is a problem that's going to affect every kind of service everywhere, anywhere from healthcare providers to community services, legal services as well. So in 2014, the National Initiative for the Care of the Elderly conducted a national telephone survey to estimate how prevalent abuse is in the community. So they looked at 5 main types of abuse, being financial, physical, psychological, sexual, and neglect. Now this study was conducted on Canadians who were 55 and over living in a community setting, not in retirement homes or in long-term care facilities. And the sample was about 8,000 seniors. After conducting this study, we've seen that about 8.2% of Canadians are abused, which represents about 766,000 seniors, which is a lot, right? And we know that this number is just going to keep going up. Throughout the province of Ontario, about 5 to 10% of seniors experience abuse, so we're looking at anywhere between 70 and 175,000 seniors. But again, this is a fluctuating thing. The reason why there's such a difference between 5 and 10%, that's a big gap, is because it's not really being reported, right? Only 1 in 5 cases are, so it's really difficult to keep track to get a real clear picture of how many people are experiencing abuse. So now that you know how severe a problem it is, let's see where you fit in all of this. So healthcare professionals are key to identifying abuse. You're able to identify signs when you see them and intervene. You can help facilitate early identification or prevention. You can speak with the senior about the suspected abuse, ask questions about potential abuse. You develop a relationship with the older adult, and you help discuss options for assistance and action. People seem to think that the abuse only happens in institutional settings, right? Because that's what the media is kind of pushing towards us. We see these horrible cases of neglect happening in long-term care facilities, people being, restrained and such. And I think people naturally assume that that's just where it occurs, but unfortunately the reality is it happens more often in the community. So I think it's important to take a look at just what's happening in institutional settings. We're aware that staff can exhibit abusive and neglectful behavior as a result of verbal or physical aggression, mostly because the people who are in long-term care facilities, they might have a cognitive impairment. And so we know that sometimes the seniors, the residents, can be physically and verbally abusive towards the staff. This increases level of stress, and the staff members tend to disassociate themselves and not be as sympathetic towards the residents, kind of see it more as like their job. And sometimes those increased levels of stress will cause them to lash out. So that's why we're seeing it. But I think what we really need to focus on here, instead of just thinking that it's a problem institutions, is just we need to know what the risks are in general to better understand how it all comes to play, whether it's happening in the community or institutions. These tend to be the same risks throughout. So I think it's important that you know these. So people who tend to be more vulnerable to elder abuse are people who have a disease, an illness, chronic illnesses, are generally more frail. People with a physical disability and such are often more dependent on others for personal care, to get around to events, to have a social life. Let's say to get to their very important Sunday brunch with their friends. And they also rely on someone for medical care to bring them to doctor's appointments and such. They might also rely on someone to dispense medications if they're not able to do so themselves. So to make sure that that medication routine is kept intact, often there has to be someone there to make sure that proper dosage is given out. Speaking of medications, some medications might impair judgment as well. I'm sure you know this already. And some of them are sought out by criminals or substance abusers, which is another added risk level for a senior who might be in a vulnerable position. So when someone says, when someone has some say and control over these aspects of your life, your social involvement, your personal care, your medical care, this puts you at risk for negligence mostly, and isolation, and that can bring on some medical issues. Cognitive impairment is another risk factor as well. Memory confusion is a big one, obviously with Alzheimer's. So people with a cognitive impairment will often have a power of attorney put in place for their to manage their finances or their personal care. And that places a potential abuser in a position of power, right? They're better able to manipulate and get whatever they want out of a situation, whether it be transferring the deed or the title to the house or taking out a second mortgage. I think a lot of abusers feel entitled to early retirement when it comes to financial abuse and exploitation. So this is particularly prominent when someone has a cognitive impairment. Obviously, mental health issues would be a key risk factor here as well, whether it's the senior who has mental health issues or the abuser themselves. It certainly increases vulnerability. There might be a personal history as well, a cycle of family violence, domestic violence. The abuser might have been abused as a child themselves, and now as mom or dad is older, they see it as an opportunity to retaliate, right? Well, now mom finally needs me, and since she abused me when I was a kid, well, I'm not going to help her out, right? So there's a lot of things that need to be considered here. There's lots of risk factors that come into play. Social isolation is another big one as well. People who have small social circles don't necessarily have anyone to confide in. There's no one around to notice changes in physical appearance or in behavior as well, right? They're less likely to hear about community resources that can help them get some much needed support. Income is another problem as well, another risk factor. People who have low incomes might also be more protective of their finances. They stash more money away. And so whenever an abuser is like a child, is their child, they'll try to get the money earlier, as early as possible before the person passes away. People with limited transportation options often don't get as socially involved, don't get to medical appointments. So whenever you see a senior that lives in a rural setting, that could be another risk factor for abuse as well. So I know the list is kind of overwhelming, right? If we look at risk factors for the abuser, they're often dependent on mom or dad for money, food, housing, or transportation. There might be substance abuse, addiction issues there. They might have poor physical or mental health. It can make it particularly difficult if they're depressed and they're a caregiver. They get, what we call caregiver burnout, and they don't necessarily know where to seek help. They don't know that there's respite services to help them alleviate some of the problems. There's obviously in-home services that could also help, cleaning the house, bathing mom or dad, making meals, Meals on Wheels. However, a lot of people don't necessarily want to reach out and get those services. I think a lot of people don't realize as well that a lot of these services are free, so they hesitate. Prejudiced attitudes, so if we talk about ageist attitudes here, I think you all know what ageism is, but of course if a person doesn't respect seniors, then that makes them more prone to manipulate an older person to their benefit, to do whatever they want. There's a lack of understanding, I think, of the aging process as well. So when a person doesn't necessarily understand what an older person is going through in their life, they might act disrespectfully. Caregiving is assumed out of resignation or obligation. So if someone is an only child and they're the only caregiver, that can place a lot of stress on them, and they don't necessarily have anyone else that can help them out. So this would be a risk factor as well, just being an only child and having to provide care for your parents. And they're likely to have a history as an abused victim as well. Over 50% of carers admit to elder abuse. More than half of them look after a relative with dementia and have been abusive towards them. After a study conducted by the University College of London, they found that 5 to 12% of caregivers admitted to being physically aggressive towards the person that they were caring for. So we know that seniors who have someone who's providing care for them, that have a caregiver, are more prone to being abused because of the caregiver burnout that occurs. So 90% of the elder abuse is perpetrated by a relative, unfortunately. Most of the time it's a man, and 30% of the time they are over the age of 60 themselves. 50% of the time it's adult children who are perpetrators. So just to give you an idea here, there's, the typical abusers might be an intimate partner who will sexually abuse or physically abuse their spouse. The incest from siblings, grandchildren, son-in-laws can occur as well in the form of the sexual abuse, obviously. It's underreported, I think, because of the shame and the humiliation that it brings. Staff in care facilities, direct care providers, housekeepers, etc. It really can be everyone and anyone. A resident, a fellow resident might bully someone else. It could be unrelated individuals as well, providing services to older adults in the community. such as PSWs, anyone who enters the home, volunteers for Meals on Wheels and such. But most of the time, it's the spouse or it's the children. So I think we need to better understand what's going on with the abuser. So let's look at what they might be experiencing. They might feel angry, frustrated, resentful. They might lack self-confidence. They are probably a person who likes to exert control and to bully others. They might have difficulty controlling their anger. They might abuse substances. They might be addicted to gambling or have other compulsive behaviors. They might be dissatisfied with their job. They might have lost their job as well and have been forced to move back in with mom or dad. There might be problems with the family relationships with siblings as well. So then often we see cases of a child who has power of attorney who will prevent their parent from seeing the other children, so their brothers and sisters, because they don't necessarily, the abuser doesn't necessarily want the siblings to be aware of what's going on at home. So by keeping them away, by screening phone calls, and preventing contact between the senior and the other children, the person who has power of attorney, who's being abusive, is able to control the environment, control what's happening at home, and without anyone else noticing what's going on. They might have health problems too. They might be fatigued, depressed, as I mentioned earlier, caregiver burnout. They might have financial problems. They might be former victims of abuse. They might be dependent on their parents financially, for childcare, for household management. I think it's certain that most of them have a limited coping capacity. We know that usually people have anger management issues as well. So I think in most cases as well, there's a lack of respect or understanding. There's often these stereotypes about what a parent should be as well, right? If we look at what am I trying to say here? If we look at what happens when we get older, parents are supposed to, take care of their children, be responsible for what's going on, help them out, provide support and assistance whenever possible. And if a child feels that sense of entitlement for help, that mom or dad is always supposed to be there for them, then they don't necessarily take into consideration the wishes of their parents. They don't necessarily bother asking how mom or dad feels about them moving back into the home. So I think there's that big gap in understanding or in respect of what's going on with their parents. So let's take a look at the general types of abuse that we see. There's financial abuse, psychological, physical, sexual, violation of civil rights, preventing seniors from practicing their religion, making decisions, removing them from the decision-making process. There's neglect, institutional and systemic abuse as well, and abandonment, which we see a lot with people who have cognitive impairments. So I think it's incumbent on you to learn to identify and detect it, know what the different types of abuse are, and know what indicators to look out for as well, which probably includes a sudden onset of questionable injuries, bruises, sprains, broken bones, scratches, burn marks, signs of restraint, lateral bruising from shaking on the forearms or around the shoulders or on the legs. There'll very much likely be a change in behavior. The person might be depressed, seem withdrawn, fearful of giving you any kind of information when you ask questions. They might be anxious. There'll be probably a change in appearance that you won't necessarily be able to detect, but family and friends would be. There would be a sudden weight loss or weight gain, poor hygiene, soiled clothes, dehydration, intoxication. These are often signs of neglect. There'll be a change in social activity as well. Friends might notice that that a person who's abused is no longer attending social events such as going to church or going to their seniors groups. not going to brunch, Sunday brunch, as I had mentioned earlier. So basically, when a person is abused, they'll avoid contact with their friends and family. There might be a change in finances as well, but that will be obviously incredibly difficult for you to detect, something that you're not going to probably encounter in your practice. But if we look at physical abuse closer, here are some of the signs. This is what happens. There's rough handling, pushing, slapping, hitting, kicking, shaking. Essentially, it's using physical force to cause pain and discomfort, right? So these are kind of the injuries that you should be looking for: the bruises, the cuts, the lateral bruising, and obviously cigarette burns, rope marks, restraint marks. So these are things that you should be aware of. This should raise some red flags. I think it's incredibly surprising the amount of cruelty that a person can inflict, especially when it's on a person that's a family member, on people who are supposed to love and care for them. But this is just, this is what it looks like. This is the sad reality. So when it comes to sexual abuse, obviously we're talking about any non-consensual touching. It could be making remarks as well of a lewd nature. Sexual exploitation. It could be something that you would look out for would be a sudden STD being transmitted in a senior. So I think you are all aware of what sexual abuse is. It could also be just joking, making jokes of a sexual nature, anything that's demeaning, essentially. When we take a look at medication abuse, a lot of people, caregivers especially, will improperly medicate a senior to keep them more docile. So they'll, we call them chemical restraints, so they might give psychotropics to keep them calm and more sleepy, to keep them in bed so that, their children, the caregiver, let's say, can do things around the house or go shopping while mom or dad are taking a nap at home. They'll often also use medication, what am I trying to say, the pain medication as well. The abuser might be using them themselves. They see an opportunity to sell the drug, so then mom or dad has less at home to treat whatever conditions that they have. Not following a prescribed routine can obviously have adverse health effects as well, so it might be negligent for a child who's supposed to be caring for their parents to not be there in the morning to administer a certain medication at a specific time with food, with lots of water, whatever, right? So this could also become problematic, especially with some medications where an individual might retain water if they don't take them. I've seen personally some cases of, an elderly woman trapped in her house where she had a caregiver, her son that was supposed to take care of her, was supposed to give her medication, but he left out of town for a few days, and a neighbor ended up knocking on the door concerned because she hadn't seen her neighbor in a while. And she was found on the ground. She had fallen. She couldn't get up. Her legs were completely swollen. So these are the kinds of, neglectful acts that we do see happening in the community. Whether the caregiver did it on purpose or not, probably not. But it doesn't make them less accountable for what has happened, right? So if we take a look at psychological abuse, this is what we believe to be the more prevalent type. We know that financial abuse is very, very much a big problem in our communities. It is considered the most common type of abuse. However, psychological abuse is probably even more prominent. It's just not reported, obviously. But it can be damaging. When you're constantly threatened or insulted or intimidating, it has lasting effects on our self-esteem and our sense of self-worth. So I think it's it's very important that we pay attention to the effects of psychological abuse as well. Financial abuse, as I had mentioned, is probably something that will be harder for you to spot. You focus more on aspects of a person's health, but I think it is still important for you to be aware that it might be happening. So here are some forms of abuse: misuse of personal checks or checks made payable to cash. Also the use of credit cards without permission. They might steal cash or income checks. They might take household goods. Things start disappearing around the house because their child is pawning them off for money. Stealing or taking jewelry for the same purpose. They might forge signatures, which would be considered as identity theft. Something that happens often, you've all been, I'm sure targeted by this, is phony charities, these great investment opportunities that pop up, or these fraudulent companies that try to extort you for money, pretending to be the Canada Revenue Agency and such. So we do see a lot of financial abuse happen through organized crime. Theft of money or belongings, wrongful use of power of attorney as well. As I had mentioned, sometimes the person who has power of attorney will try to change the deed of the house, will try to alter wills, will try to also isolate a person. So let's say someone has power of attorney, mom or dad lives in a long-term care facility. They might prevent visitation from friends and family. So by isolating the person, the power of attorney becomes the only person in that senior's life who's there, who interacts with them socially. And so the senior will do everything possible to maintain that relationship, that one point of contact that they have with the external world. Possible indicators to look out for is a sudden inability for that senior to pay rent or pay bills. So if they tell you that all of a sudden they don't have electricity at home, they weren't able to pay their phone bills, and this has never been an issue before, then this would be a sign of a problem at home financially. There might be a sudden withdrawal of money from accounts. Obviously not something you'll recognize in your practice, but maybe in your own social circle. Maybe you have older friends or your own parents as well. If you notice that their bank statements are just don't jive, let's say, where you see a sudden big chunk of money coming out, or a sudden loan that the senior takes on and they're not able to explain what the loan was for. And that should be raising some red flags. The abuser will often open mail without permission, especially when they're looking for checks. Although now in the days of direct deposit, it's not as much of an issue. There might be refusal to consider a move to another care facility. They might try to control, or sell money or property without permission. And there'd be suspicious changes in the wills or in power of attorney. So if we take a look at neglect is the failure to provide care and assistance required for health, safety, or well-being. So this could be inaction, right? So not providing food, water, medication, education. Sometimes it's active neglect, so the abuser is doing it on purpose, or the passive neglect, which often occurs because the person is too ignorant or is immature or lacks resources to be able to help mom or dad. So here are some types of neglect. So denying access to service, over or under medicating, inadequate supervision in institutional settings, failure to provide medical attention, failure to listen and respond to expressed needs or concerns of the individual, failure to respond to calls for assistance. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But things that you should be looking out for, as I had mentioned, are changes in physical appearance, if you see your patients on a recurring basis. But there would be signs of dehydration, a change in weight, There might be emaciation, sunken eyes to look out for. There might be withdrawal. There might be some withdrawal there, some intoxication as well. Mostly when medication abuse comes into play, they might not seem, all there. They might be wearing inappropriate clothing for the weather as well, right? If they're wearing long sleeve shirts during the summer months or during the winter, they don't have a winter coat. This is neglectful. They might have poor personal hygiene as well. If no one, is providing at-home services, person is not bathed, they might have soiled clothing as well. There might be extreme body odor. Long fingernails is another big one. So for you, I think it's important for you to be observant of these kinds of indicators of potential abuse. There will probably most likely be a delay between the injury and seeking or receiving care. You might notice in your charts as well that they've been in for a similar injury before, or they might be receiving treatment at multiple hospitals trying to avoid suspicion, right? They might not have a regular doctor as well. More often than not, if the abuser is accompanying the senior, he won't want the same doctor to see them so that they're not able to spot differences in behavior or in physical appearance. So by having different doctors all the time, they're able to protect themselves from being seen. There might be obviously an unlikely mechanism of injuries. If they're telling you that they've fallen down the stairs and they have a black eye, well, that's probably not what happened, right? We know that you'd be looking at injuries happening on the legs or the palms of the hands. And if there's no witnesses to these unexplainable injuries as well, that would be something that would raise some flags for me. They might be afraid of telling you what happened as well. If they stutter or seem anxious, or if the abuser is there with them, then they'll always be trying to intervene and answer on behalf of the senior. So that's something to be aware of. There might also be an outright refusal of services, especially when you're suggesting in-home services or refer them to another type of service that will help with counseling or respite care or anything like that. They'll probably flat out refuse your help. So that's something that you should be suspicious of. So I think that it's really important to know the kinds of things that you'll be assessing. So you need to know, how often the abuse happens, what the consequences are, when did it start, what triggered it, you also need to know what the victim wants as well. What are their desires? What are their wants and needs? If they come from a different cultural background as well, they might have, roles and responsibilities at home, certain traditions or values that are ingrained in them that will maybe act as a barrier to them seeking out help. So I think it's important that you know all of this before you jump into trying to find a solution. You have to think about what's best for the senior, not necessarily, what would be the best solution. So yeah, you'd think, okay, if there's a risk of physical harm, you think, okay, well, maybe we need to involve the police, but the senior might not necessarily want to do that, and it's important that you consider the senior's feelings as well, what they want, what their lifestyle is, what the family dynamics are. Because if they don't want to necessarily lose that relationship that they have with the abuser, then sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where you're going to have to help the abuser to be able to help the senior. So in order for you to confirm your observations, there is lots of tools out there for you that give you a variety of different questions that you can use to interview your patients. But I think it's important that you don't ask the questions directly, because you might frighten them. I know you have only a certain amount of time with your patients. But I think it's important for you to try to build the trust, the therapeutic relationship with the patients in order to get the answers that you really need. You have to show that you're concerned. Because if you just give them the impression that, you know, you're just flying through, you just need a quick diagnostic to get for your records so that you can move on to the next patient, then they're not going to open up to you. So you need to keep that door open, and the only way you're going to do that is to show that you're concerned, that you really are concerned. So try to use common statements. In our line of work, we'll often, you know, if we want to find out if there's a problem, we'll say, I don't know if this is a problem for you, but because so many patients I see are dealing with abusive relationships, I've started asking about it routinely. So then, you know, you're just, I guess, making it seem that it's okay to talk about it, that it's part of your routine, that you aren't pinpointing the fact that they are experiencing abuse, that it's just part of your screening process. They'll probably feel more comfortable opening up to you if they know that other people are being abused as well, that they're not alone in all of this. You might have to assess the caregiver as well, if they're there. I am going to suggest right away that if you do have a patient that you suspect is being abused, ask them questions alone. Don't ask them questions in front of, you know, their child that is beside them, because if they are the abuser, then you know, the senior will not likely open up about what's happening, be truthful about what's happening at home if the person who's abusing them is right beside them, right? It's just common sense. I know that sometimes, you know, there's cognitive issues. So the person might have some dementia, and that's why the other person is there, or the other person's there just to jot down, you know, medication routines so that they know what's going on, and what the treatment process is going to be for that patient. But I do think it is really important that you speak to the senior alone whenever possible. And then you can interview the other person afterwards if they are a caregiver. These are some examples of questions that you could ask as well. Show again that you're concerned about them as well, that you understand how difficult it can be to care for a senior, that, you know, your life is essentially turned upside down. You have all these responsibilities for, you know, on top of your own. If you have a family, you have your own obligations at home. It could be extremely daunting and stressful for people who can't cope. So I think it's important that you ask them questions and make them feel like you're concerned about their health as well. So these are lists of questions that you can ask. You've got to inquire about how things are at home, if they feel safe, if they have enough to eat. You know, do you take medications as prescribed? Are you assisted with personal care? And if any of those answers are yes, then try to give them permission to disclose, to open up and answer those questions. You know, if they do say that, yes, okay, you know, I'm not being bathed as often, then let them know that that is neglectful and that it is problematic. You got to affirm their rights to live safely and to have their needs met. And so it's quite the process, right? There's lots of information that you need to consider when you're intervening, planning an intervention, and all of this you need to take into consideration. Their confidentiality, who are you going to refer to, what kind of law enforcement agencies need to be involved if there is risk of imminent harm. Safety planning is another thing. But this is obviously lots for you to do. So I think you need to realize that you need to work as a team. It's a multidisciplinary team effort when responding to cases of abuse. So domains, areas that you're going to need to focus on are: what is the patient's physical condition? What is their mental state? What are the relationships? What are the family dynamics that are coming into play? Are they being cared for? Is there a caregiver? What is the environment at home? So here are checklists, right? So if there's a mental health problem, you know, you You might notice that they're confused, or depressed, anxious, fearful, suspicious. If you look at physical indicators, you know, we're looking for the bruising, the low weight, the dehydration, broken bones. So these are just lists that you can have with you. Print them off, store them in your drawer. Just keep in mind that these things are possible indicators of the presence of abuse. So the stories are inconsistent between the caregiver and the potential victim of abuse. The caregiver wouldn't let you talk to the patient alone. They seem stressed out or worried about it. There were previous reports of abuse. There was a delay in seeking care. So all of these questions come into play, and I think it's really incumbent on you to know what these questions are, what are the things that you need to consider during an intervention to be able to develop and design a proper strategy with other members in the society. We're running out of time? Yeah, okay, I know. Usually this is a 2-hour presentation, guys. So it's really hard to go through all of the important steps, but I think if you look through the materials that you have, you'll see that there's lots of tools out there to help you screen. Elder Abuse Ontario has a decision tree as well to help you through the process. You know, if somebody has a cognitive impairment, these are the questions you should ask. If they don't, then these are the steps you need to follow. So it's all broken down for you. Just make sure, as I mentioned, that you keep the seniors' wishes in mind. I respect the fact that they have the right to make their own decisions, even if you feel uncomfortable with them. And try to be there for the senior and the abuser themselves, because often the senior won't want to come clean with what's happening unless the person who's abusing them, their children, are offered help as well. So I guess, do you have any questions? I'll take a few questions real quick.